Good evening. This is round two for me of recordings for today. Uh, this one is obviously, if you're looking at your screen, about the Industrial Revolution Techbook questions that you had. I know that your work is divided up into sections, but I'm going to go ahead and cover 6 through 10 here so that we don't have to make separate videos. You really do, for clarification purposes, need to be reading all of this. But I thought that this might be good because I've highlighted some of the important text that you'll need to know specifically be related to the questions that are on ProProf's quizzes. So we're talking about in agricultural societies at the very beginning of this. This is how did industrialization influence social societies? And if you'll recall, before the Industrial Revolution, we were all in that traditional economy with agricultural societies. And this is from the notes that you took when you rotated around my classroom. Land was how you measured your wealth and social class. And so, of course, most of the nobility owned all of the land, and the peasants farmed the land and were allowed to live there. So as we move into the Industrial Revolution, we have a different kind of class of people created called the industrialists. And this is defined as owners of factories and manufacturing companies, along with some inventors. And they called themselves, of course, the industrialists. Now, these people who invented and started to own companies and manufacture things in their factories were called entrepreneurs. And an entrepreneur is someone who takes a risk, of course, to start a new business, and they have to go through the process of getting a loan and then seeing if their factory can make a profit. And if they were lucky enough, they became quite powerful and wealthy, okay, because of their risk that they took as an entrepreneur. So this is particularly important here because it says that they were also examples of social mobility, or this ability now to move up or possibly down within the social classes, because if your business didn't work, then you could actually turn out worse than you were and end up sort of like a peasant. All righty, so let's carry on here. Okay, so I talked earlier about the fact that you had to have money to be able to start up your new company. So you went to the bank and you asked for a loan, or you kind of talked to your neighbors to see if they'd give you some money. And those people would have been called the investors who would lend you the money. And if those new companies succeeded, those people that had invested in your company would get a pretty hefty profit. Okay, and so this again was how we moved away from the agricultural traditional society into this capitalist society is kind of where we're headed in the Industrial Revolution. All right, part 2, next section of middle class growth. They, of course, grew as a result of urbanization, where the farmers sold their land who lived in the country and began moving to cities so that they could take advantage of the new technologies in the factories and make money. So as the middle class began to grow in wealth, here's how we have a change of political power. They realized that they had some powers, demanded powers, and they wanted more democratic rights. So in 1832, this thing in England was passed called the Reform Act. And it reduced the power of some of those wealthy landowners by giving more power to the new middle class voters. So Parliament heard their cry for some rights and met their needs by giving them some votes. All right, so we've talked about the middle class and the industrial class, and now we're going to go into the working class. Okay, so these were the people that needed money Okay, and so they started working in the factory because they had absolutely left their farms, sold their farms. And the idea here is that you needed more people to work to be able to make enough money to live. So at this point, the women and children were employed in the factory. And we know that it wasn't really a world for equality during the Industrial Revolution. So the children and the women were oftentimes paid less for than the work that they did in the factories. All right, the next paragraph goes on to talk about here, this paragraph, okay, which I'm not going to leave highlighted. But this talks about the conditions of the factories, and we covered already when we did our Duxter's article that. But the idea was that the conditions were so bad that the workers decided here to unite to form a trade union. Okay. And they would protest and make negotiations with, oh my goodness, this isn't working for me. Can you go away? Well, okay, there, at least I got it out of the way. Sorry about that. Okay, so the negotiations were more successful and worked in some parts of the world than in others. Particularly notable, the first strike where the people actually quit working was in this place called Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Now, the strike idea caught on and spread, but it was not necessarily too popular within Europe. So in Europe, because of these strikes, the government decided it was going to take a stand with the owners, and it did forbid the trade unions until 1824. Beginning in 1799, all of the unions were outlawed. But seeing that there really was a need for workers' rights and some protections, they rethought it in 1824 and allowed them to reform, but under close restrictions. And just like in the United States, even today, we do have unions, but they are sort of monitored by the government for good or bad. I'll let you do the research and make that decision. All righty, so that was pretty good. I breezed through that section about the new classes, and I'm going to move on to 7. All right, so we talked about the factory production system already, and the mass production. Of course, the goods were being made much faster by the machines than they were the man. And so as this mass production idea increased, more people chose to move out of the country into the cities, okay, looking for work. And so this population shift, we have already discussed this word in great depth, is known as urbanization. When you worked for the brief amount of time that you did on your urban game, you could see already, and we had only done it just a few times, that you were gonna run out of room pretty fast. So that's sort of what was happening in the cities, is they really were running out of room because they had no place to live and build, and it was an issue. So we already talked about the life in the towns, but we'll review that. Although lots and lots of people were employed, the problem was they were not being paid well. And so their living conditions were not good either. Remember, they were crammed into small quarters, side by sides, into what would become now the word slum, okay? Poor section of town with lots and lots of people. And we know, especially now that we have talked about the great stink, that disease could spread quickly due to lack of sewers and sanitation in the crowded areas. And, at this time, they didn't know much still about the spread of germs. And so, consequently, people died of disease. And a lot of them died of disease, and they didn't live very long. So we know that over time, these living conditions did improve gradually. There were some scientific advancements made with vaccines and with discovery of germs and sanitation standards, and that's all mentioned, I think, on the next page. But anyway, what else made these living conditions improve gradually was that over time the factories became more and more efficient with the introduction of the assembly line. And so workers' pay began to increase, and so did their standard of living, which means that if you're making money and more money, you can buy nicer things and more things. And along with that comes your better health. So another important part of the Industrial Revolution, aside from the living conditions improving because of the factory conditions, new technologies also improved the quality of the average worker's life. Now, this is covered here, and there are some questions that ask you to read and decide on what kind of technologies you think would have been the most important. So I'm not going to cover this particular section very much. That's for you to read and decide, hey, oh, this is a nice invention or need, or ooh, I like this one the most, and it's made the most change in the world, and I'm going to leave that one up to you. All right, now, we already know that before the Industrial Revolution, we were in this traditional economy, which meant that people lived on farms and worked on farms in the country. And we know that by the mid-1800s, more than half of all those people who had, migrated, that's what that's called, into the cities, lived in cities. They had moved out, okay? And this pattern occurred around the world. Particularly, we've talked about the Industrial Revolution taking place in the United States. Well, eventually, as the Industrial Revolution spread around the world, okay, people needed to get to those places where the Industrial Revolution was occurring, such as England and such as the United States. So they began to migrate, okay, and when you migrate, you're called an immigrant, okay, and where all this was going on, of course, was in Europe. So it says here that the population of Europe grew quickly during this time, okay, and people competed for scarce resources and employment. So this led to a population boom out, okay, of Europe for some people, where they knew that they could also move to find jobs. Once Europe became, populated and all the jobs in Europe were filled, they began to migrate to Canada and the United States looking for work, because you got to go where the work is so that you can get a paycheck. All right. So now that takes care of 7. So hang with me. We've got 8, 9, and 10 to go. Or you can fast forward if you think you're good with 8. And you don't want to sit here and let me go all the way through. All right, but I will eventually finish this up with 8, 9, and 10. Let's start with 8. All right, this is about public health, and we discussed briefly in 7 that with the new technologies came improvements to our life. All right, so what we learned during the Industrial Revolution was more about the spread of diseases. And if you've been tuned in for the Great Stink, I focused particularly on the cholera disease. And in the Great Stink, that's what's going on in London. Now, until this point, in 1854, no one remembered that the poopy water had the germs in it, and that people were drinking the poopy water with the germs, and that's how the cholera was spread. So John Snow decided that he was going to look and map out some of the neighborhoods within London. And when he did, what did he realize? The cholera deaths were clustered around certain public water pumps. So his idea was that the disease was spread by this thing called a germ cell. And it was strange at the time, but the more that they studied his work and his maps, it kind of made sense. And so the medical community gradually accepted his idea that organisms could spread a disease from one person to another. And at this point, they realized that they could pretty much wipe out the cholera. Okay, now this germ cell idea, this bacteria idea, was also key to improving public health. Okay, so with the discovery of bacteria, this germ idea, we had many innovations in hygiene. And your hygiene, of course, is the way that you clean yourself. And with, or you clean sterilizing tools in operating rooms. This bacteria idea, we need to be clean. Our tools need to be clean. And if we are sterilizing ourselves and our operating rooms, then perhaps we can stop the spread of contagions. And that is the study of how diseases are spread. And is that through indirect or direct contact? Particularly important right now. We're trying to figure out how to stop the spread of the COVID-19 virus. And while we know that it can be spread through direct contact, we also know that it can be spread through indirect contact in the air. And so that's why you see lots of people wearing the masks, because it's this contagion idea. We're trying to figure out how to stop it from spreading both indirectly and directly. So once we figure out how that, for example, the COVID-19 virus is spread, we are going to be able to, that bacteria that spreads it, we're going to be able to isolate that bacteria, examine it, and then develop some kind of vaccine related to that bacteria once we figure out how to manipulate it. And then hopefully we'll be able to be vaccinated and there won't be another pandemic of COVID-19 again. We will wipe it out. Okay, so it's important to understand, this is just exactly what I said, that once we have isolated some of the bacterias and we can weaken the bacteria, we can inject it into our bodies and we will make some toxins or antibodies against the disease. And this is first done by a British scientist named Edward Jenner, and he invented the smallpox vaccine. And you can read here more about how that he took a cowpox virus to do that. All righty, moving right along. I'm trying to hurry for you guys, but I really wanted, to maybe help you understand some of the stuff that you read in this, because it's rather overwhelming.
You done?
Nope, still working. I have Explore 9 and 10 to do, and then I'm done. All right. I do. Okay, so this is a lot of sciencey stuff. And I think I've covered, did I cover 9? No. Okay, so building blocks of life, of course. Again, this is all your sciencey stuff. And probably Miss Mergen should be teaching this, but it's in our social studies curriculum, so let's do it. All right. First is the cell theory. And cell theory states that cells are the smallest form of life and that all living things are made of cells. So if you are living, you have cells. Now, how does this help us during the Industrial Revolution? Learning about cells and how they reproduce helps scientists understand more about how the body works, ways that we could prevent diseases like that cholera. And then we also began to learn more about our traits, how we inherit diseases, and of course that means how diseases are passed on from one generation to the next. Now, specifically, we start looking at Mendel's work, who sat around and tried to figure out, well, how exactly do we inherit these traits like our blue eyes and our, I don't know, color of hair, those kinds of things. So he figured out that the best thing to use to study and as part of his experiment was the pea plant. And the reason why the pea plant is so important is there were lots of varieties of those. And so he could figure out lots and lots of different traits and how they varied because the pea plant was so varied with different traits. All right, so what exactly did he figure out that was so beneficial? Okay. Scientists, from examining his work, could understand the ways in which genetic variation occurred. So maybe one of my children has brown hair and one of my children has blonde hair and I have red hair. And so how the heck does that? Bottom line, during the time, this was most important for farmers because this would allow them to create and grow the strongest crops based on what they knew about parent plants. And of course, now more than ever, we look to our genetic variations when we want to know about diseases which we might inherit and those diseases which we are trying to prevent with that could be genetically passed on. So in 2020, it's not so much about the farmers and the crops anymore as it is about the humans and how we can prevent ourselves from inheriting diseases. Alrighty, so I didn't put much information, if any, on your ProProfs quiz about the theory of natural selection. I know that Mr. Woody is going to cover that pretty heavily with you, and Ms. Fall will cover that with you in 8th grade next year. So just remember that natural selection is well, I'll just read what Darwin says. The accepted explanation of how traits help an organism survive as they evolve. So I'm going to not get into that section very much. But here it's important to note that public health and biology contributed to a much, much longer and better quality of life for all of us during the revolution, industrial and 2020. It's impacted us even now. Alrighty, the last one. I've made it through, and if you've been watching me, I'm proud of you for hanging in there with me, or at least fast forwarding to get to the different sections that you might have needed some help with. That's pretty good with the recorded video. You can fast forward Miss Byrd to get really what you need. And I'm not offended. Alrighty, so this page is pretty important because it's going to lead up to our next unit on imperial expansion. And you have to understand imperialism before you can understand what led to World War I. So we've talked a lot about industrialization in two places, the grain, Europe and the United States, but you got to understand that it was also going on in those newly independent Latin American countries wherever we said it's on the boulevard, and how that these Latin American nations who had been colonized by France and Portugal and Spain became independent. So up and coming stars that were part of industrialization were Mexico and Brazil. And at some point, as you need raw materials to industrialize and make things in your factories, you're going to start getting into this problem of competition. Okay, so In order to kind of not compete, okay, and be the top dog, I guess, countries started specifically focusing on one or two products. And that allowed them to gain wealth because they knew they could do that one thing that people needed and they could do it very well. So specialization was beneficial because people could invest money in this one main industry, okay, and it didn't cost all that much because you were just investing in that one company and that one product. And that allowed them to become competitive uh, with other countries. Now, that was the positive, but it also had a negative here in blue. It was a risky thing because countries became vulnerable to economic problems if demands for their particular product uh, were not very high. Okay, and so they were not able to produce and sell what they needed to keep their country's economy afloat. And it also was a negative thing because nations had to become more dependent on trade with other nations to get those products that they were not specializing in. So, uh, again, competition is a risky thing. And if you don't try to make everything that you need, then ultimately you may not have what you need. Okay, so as a result, these industrial and non-industrial countries became more economically reliant on one another. Now we know that because of the age of exploration, people were trading with each other all over the world, but because of the Industrial Revolution, the new demand, this is really important, for raw materials and improved transportation technologies caused by the Industrial Revolution made trade even more important and competitive. So instead of trading, European countries would try to meet their needs by, and we talked a lot about this, colonizing other countries. And this idea of I have to colonize foreign countries and take them over to get my resources is called the imperial expansion, henceforth imperialism. And even though the word is not spelled the same, people wanted to build an empire. And that is the E word, E-M-P-I-R-E. So imperialism, let's expand the empire, the E-M-P-I-R-E. Now, most of the European countries began expanding and their imperialism expansion in the countries of Africa and Asia. Okay, and when they took over these parts of the world, they got easy access because now they owned the country. They were the mother country. They got easy access to these very, very important raw materials or supplies that they needed: rubber and petroleum. Okay, so with imperialism, countries began to expand and compete with one another for business. Okay, and we're not really going to get into the taxes or the tariffs that we had already talked about that were placed on foreign goods. But you must just note that this is kind of where we stop uh, and we begin our new unit on imperialism. Bottom line is, by the end of the Industrial Revolution, this is what had happened. New workforce was created. There were many industry breakthroughs in agriculture, of course, in our factories. Science had transformed society. We were living longer. We could communicate better because we could transport materials and ourselves all around the world. So I hope you appreciate my quick run through and summarizing of Techbook 6 through 10. And if you do have any questions, replay the video, or you can always email me. Hope you are surviving your coronavirus shut-in time, and look forward to seeing you back at school soon.